Hi, everybody. This is Positive Relationships Part 2. So, last time we were talking about ideas of relationships, and specifically, we ended with talking about interdependence theory, which is all about ideas of expectations. So, let's go ahead and start this one by asking a couple more questions about some relationships and talking through them. So, go ahead and answer this one. Spouses in arranged marriages love their spouse more or less or the same than spouses in unarranged marriages. Well, now, of course, this depends on a lot of different things, but there's at least one study that finds that spouses that were in arranged marriages actually loved their spouse more over the space of about 10 years than did spouses in unarranged American marriages. Now, what are we talking about in this case? Now, I'm not saying that you should go and get an arranged marriage. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. What I am saying is that a lot of what we find in terms of dissatisfaction in relationships, specifically in American marriages, tends to happen really pretty quickly within the first few years of marriage. What happens is we seem to find that expectations for what marriage should be, at least in the United States, are really quite high. In traditional times, even in the United States, the expectations of what marriage would entail and what it would not entail had a lot to do with more pragmatic thoughts, right? Ideas of childcare, income, etc., and was less about romantic love and sexual attraction. Now, in today's world, much of what constitutes a marriage and why people get married is involved with this idea of romantic attraction, which is a lot to do with sexual attraction and other, being excited just to be in the relationship with somebody. Turns out that tends to lead to a pretty high standard, especially when we know that sexual attraction, sexual passion tends to decrease relatively precipitously over time inside of a marriage. And if we also have a lot of destiny beliefs, as a lot of Americans do, about what a marriage should and shouldn't be, as opposed to working ideas of growth that you should work towards a marriage, then that leads to a lot of disillusionment. So, in terms of the interdependence theory, that means that Americans often have a pretty high CL, a comparison level of what they expect based off of their destiny beliefs, based off of their um, ideas of what marriage should be a part of, etc. Whereas spouses in arranged marriages start at a pretty low expectation and tend to learn to love each other over time. And so we find that over the course of 10 years, American marriages that are unarranged by choice, they tend to decline in satisfaction, whereas the arranged marriages tend to increase. Now, that's not all arranged marriages. That's that particular study that finds that, but it really brings out this idea of what is available and what's not available and the expectations that are involved when you think about what makes you happy in a relationship. A lot of it is based off of your expectations and meeting those expectations. So let's go ahead and ask this question. You're more likely to fall in love with a person if you meet them where? Well, as we've seen in the idea of misattribution of arousal, we could have a lot of ideas of excitation transfer, meaning that people might actually fall for somebody more if they're at the gym. We often underestimate the situational factors that lead us to have good relationships or bad relationships. And that can be basic stuff, like the fact of who we are attributing attraction to, whether that is based off of them actually causing that attraction, or if it's situational factors that are causing those feelings of attraction towards somebody. So, for example, a misattribution of arousal and excitation transfer would say that if somebody is running a long time on the treadmill at the gym, and then they happen to look at you and like, whoa, that person's making my heart beat fast. When in reality, it's not you making their heart beat fast, it's the fact that they ran on the treadmill. Giving someone the silent treatment is a good way to make them change their behavior. No, that's not a good way to do that. A lot of the ideas of expectations that we have in relationships are based on the ideas of communication, right? We're trying to communicate that we care about and are willing to, provide what that person needs or wants. If you stop talking to somebody when you're angry with them, you are just stopping talking. They don't know why you did that. And you're like, oh, well, they should know. Well, they don't know. They might, but You stopping talking to them is not the best way to communicate how you would like that to change. We talked about XYZ statements and the idea of you trying to be accommodating, etc. Well, it turns out that the silent treatment is often called stonewalling, right? And stonewalling is awful for relationships. It's one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, according to John Gottman, who's one of the foremost researchers in communication in relationships. The four horsemen of the apocalypse. These are things that if they happen in just in your communication, in your relationship, it's going to signal the apocalypse, the end of the world of your relationship. They are criticism. And criticism means criticism. I mean, you're like, oh, well, it's constructive criticism. No, I mean, it's criticism, right? Criticism is one of them. If you have a lot of that, that's bad. Contempt. Contempt is straight mockery, right? It's mocking somebody. That's, oh man, it's awful for a relationship. Defensiveness. Defensiveness is when people feel defensive, like, oh, well, you do that, and they feel defensive in the conversation, right? They feel like they need to defend their ego, their self-image. And the last one is stonewalling, which is the silent treatment. It's just stopping talking to someone in the relationship. People expect that you're going to talk with them if you're in a relationship. They expect that you're going to communicate with them. Yeah, they do. And when you just stop that, you're basically betraying the expectation of what they expect in a good relationship partner. You're just saying, oh, well, you're not good enough to talk to anymore. And they don't know why either. So in terms of actually changing the bad behavior, this is a really awful way to do that. If you are angry with somebody, you need to talk with them. Now, silent treatment's a little bit different from taking a timeout. There are times when people are in a conversation and they just need to take a timeout so they don't do something or say something that they're going to regret. That is different. Now, the difference between silent treatment and taking a timeout is that taking a timeout, like in sports, means that it's not permanent, right? And you know that it's going to end. In fact, generally in a timeout, you know when it's going to end. It's going to be for a specific amount of time, okay? And you do it so that you can better participate in the game. Silent treatment is just walking away with the ball, okay? That's the difference. If you're going to use a timeout, you need to say, hey, I need to take a timeout or else I'm going to say something that I'm going to regret. And then you need to, ideally, you'll tell them when you're willing to talk with them again. I need to take a time out until tomorrow, and then we can continue this conversation. So let's talk about this tomorrow at lunch, right? That would be a timeout. Silent treatment is just refusing to talk. That is bad for relationships. Don't do that. Don't do that. Speaking of bad for relationships, let's talk about power. John just asked Jill to go out on a date. Who has more power in the relationship? Well, Jill does. There's something called the principle of lesser interest. The person who has less interest in the relationship has more power in the relationship. Now, if you get caught up in this idea of power, especially in like a dating relationship, boy, that can be problematic over time. In general, people have more power in the relationship than they think they do. This is often because we can understand our needs in the relationship, but it's hard to see the other person. So just like it's easy for me to know when I'm hungry, it's hard for me to tell when you're hungry, right? It's easy for me to tell the needs that I have for belonging and caring, right? And for the relationship. And it's hard for me to see your need for belonging and caring and need for the relationship. What that means then is I can see the power that you have over me in the relationship, but it's harder for me to see how much you need me in the relationship, okay? We often underestimate the amount of power we have in the relationship. If you're in a huge power dynamic, you're trying to figure out, hey, who's got more power in the relationship, it might be a bad sign if we're trying to fight about who's got more power in this relationship. Ideally, people are trying to work together to improve the relationship, and both parties are trying to work to better improve the relationship. That's generally what we should be having in a good relationship power dynamic. Is it true that men do not understand nonverbal communication as well as women? Well, a lot of studies that say that this is true. Men do not understand nonverbal communication as well as women. Now, most of these are American studies, by the way, right? We call this nonverbal sensitivity. So here's how you do it. You take a man and a woman, So let's say that they're a married couple. You bring them in and you have them have a conversation, but this time you just take out the audio, right? You have the man try and communicate something to the woman, and the woman try to communicate something to the man, but they do it without any audio. It turns out that women are able to read, to understand what men are trying to communicate nonverbally better than men are at communicating with women. However, when you take those same tapes and you give them to outside observers, the outside observers can understand what the woman is trying to say better than what the man is trying to say. So it seems that men are worse at actually expressing what they want nonverbally, but they also are worse at understanding what women want, what others want, anyone wants, nonverbally as well. Is this a difference in ability? Well, it does seem to be a little bit of ability, but it turns out that when you actually use proper incentives like money, so you're going to pay someone like the man to pay someone if they accurately understand what's going on, they do a whole lot better. So part of this is the idea of incentive. Men tend to evidently express less incentive for trying to understand nonverbal communication. But it also does seem to be just either a cultural ability or practice that happens over time. They're less able to do it as well. Okay? Nonverbal communication is really important in relationships because a lot of what we discuss is kind of intimated. It's not really based off of what we say in terms of syntax and grammar. It's more about how we say it and what the intention is. Who is best able to predict whether your current dating relationship will last? Your best friend, your mother, or you? Well, they've done the study on this, and guess what? It's not you. It tends to be your best friend, right? So what they did in this particular study is that they went and they found college-aged women who were in a dating relationship. And they asked, how long do you think that this relationship will last? And they asked it to the person in the relationship, that person's mother, and that person's best friend. Well, it turns out the person who was worst at predicting how long the relationship would last was the actual woman in the relationship. The best was their best friend, and then the second best was the mother. The idea is that it seems that when we are in relationships, we tend to not be totally objective, and turns out that's a good thing. In fact, having positive illusions about your relationships can actually be beneficial for the satisfaction and longevity of the relationship. People who are in good relationships tend to tend to lessen the degree to which negative traits in their partners are interacting or affecting them, right? So, for example, what this means is, between me and my wife, if my wife has a negative trait, then I'm more likely to not focus on that, right? To undervalue what that is, okay? To have a positive illusion. Oh, she's not as bad as that is, right? And that tends to have a good effect on the relationship. Now, I'm not telling you to go delude yourself as to your relationship partners. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, positive illusions tend to happen pretty automatically. People in good relationships tend to think that their relationship overall is better than the average relationship. They think that that their relationships are going to be more happy and stable and more satisfying. And guess what? It tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It tends to indicate optimism and the willing to work, which is great. Now, deluding yourself, that's bad. I don't want you to go out there and just pretend like somebody is this superhuman when in reality they're a human, okay? But when people are in good relationships, they tend to not be very objective. Now, what that means is that they tend to have positive associations with it, and they might not be able to pick up on negative signs that others may be able to pick up on. So, for example, your best friend probably sees your relationship quite objectively and is able to predict whether or not it's going to last more accurately than you are. Why? Because you are biased and you think that it should last because you're in it. Why would you be in it if you didn't think it was going to be a good reason, worth working on at least? But your best friend and your mother are probably more accurate at telling when the relationship is going to end than you are. All right. Well, I think that is all we have for this particular part. Thanks, everybody.